When you're looking to study abroad, you're not just looking for a great place to learn. You're looking for the experience of a lifetime. Welcome to Nelson Mandela University. Nelson Mandela University is the largest tertiary institution in the Eastern and Southern Cape, offering 6 unique locations, including the only campus in Africa situated on a nature reserve. Nelson Mandela University is a home away from home to students from countries around the globe. With a passion for the beautiful environment and unique individuals, we strive to live each day respecting the diversity of those around us as we work together for a true
doing.
When you're looking to study abroad, you're not just looking for a great place to learn. You're looking for the experience of a lifetime. Welcome to Nelson Mandela University. Nelson Mandela University is the largest tertiary institution in the Eastern and Southern Cape, offering 6 unique locations, including the only campus in Africa situated on a nature reserve. Nelson Mandela University is a home away from home to students from countries around the globe. With a passion for the beautiful environment and unique individuals, we strive to live each day respecting the diversity of those around us as we work together for a truly holistic educational experience. And when it's really time to get out of the classroom and do what students do best, you can be sure there'll always be a great view on your horizon. Welcome to Nelson Mandela University. When you're looking to study abroad, you're not just looking for a great place to learn. You're looking for the experience of a lifetime. Welcome to Nelson Mandela University. Nelson Mandela University is the largest tertiary institution in the Eastern and Southern Cape, offering 6 unique locations, including the only campus in Africa situated on a nature reserve. Nelson Mandela University is a home away from home to students from countries around the globe. With a passion for the beautiful environment and unique individuals, we strive to live each day respecting the diversity of those around us as we work together for a truly holistic educational experience. And when it's really time to get out of the classroom and do what students do best, you can be sure there'll always be a great view on your horizon. Welcome to Nelson Mandela University.
Greetings, colleagues, and greetings to our esteemed speakers for today, our moderator, and the leadership of all institutions represented here today. My name is Uyandisa Jubase, and I work as a research assistant at the Center for Women and Gender Studies. My task, colleagues, is simply to come and welcome every one of you and kickstart such an exciting program. Colleagues, we gather under the theme, of course, that says gender equality, legacies of 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and platform for action. We take this time to reflect on how far we have come since this historical moment, and most importantly, what the journey to attaining gender equality still requires of us today. Colleagues, it is then fitting as we begin today's discussion on what is set aside as a public holiday to observe Human Rights Day in South Africa, that we echo and reiterate the words of Hillary Clinton, who spoke at this Beijing conference, that says, women's rights are in fact human's rights. To help us with this immeasurable task is, of course, the Executive Director of the United Nations Women, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, Ambassador Thenjiwe Mtintso, Dr. Beverly Ditsi, and our moderator, Prof. Yolande Buka. But before we get into this exciting discussion, I'd like to call upon our Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, to do the opening and welcoming for us, and thereafter move straight into the Interim Director for the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Dr. Babalwa Makoqana, who will then introduce the moderator and give us a synopsis of why we gather here today. Ngalo mazwi, I'd like to say Ndiyabulela, and over to you, Prof. Mutwa.
Nkosi Andisa for that. Mine is a very brief role this afternoon. So good evening, colleagues. I want to start by welcoming those that are joining us here this evening in South Africa, and also a very good morning to others that are joining from different parts of the globe. I know that in the US is in the morning at the moment. I want to greet the friends of the university, our students, our staff, our community members, our participants that are watching this event through the different platforms. It gives me great pleasure in particular to welcome our Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the chairperson of our governing council, Ambassador Nozipho January Badil, members of our council from the 3 hosting universities, the University of Rhodes, the University of Pretoria, and Mandela University. I would also want to greet all our management teams and leaderships that are here, the Deputy Vice Chancellors, the Deans, the heads of departments and entities of our 3 institutions. I would like to mention Dr. Mabukang Munapula Mapesela from Rhodes, who is a DVC for Academic and Student Affairs, and Professor Andre Kiet, who is a DVC for Engagement and Transformation here at Nelson Mandela, and all the other leadership of these universities, which I've not mentioned by name. I want to recognize all the scholars and academics that have joined us this evening. And I would also like to really thank all participants and staff and students from different universities who are on the platform, members of the university publics, and all our communities, because we are indeed an outward-facing university. I particularly wish to welcome our distinguished speakers for this evening that Yandisa has mentioned, the UN Women's Executive Director, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. Welcome, Sis Phumzile, and thank you for making this possible for us, for you to come and be part of one of the panelists. And I would like to also welcome in particular one of our other speakers, Ambassador Thenjiwe Mtintso, Dr. Bev Ditsi, and our moderator, Professor Yolande Buka, all of whom will be introduced officially, of course, during the course of the program. I wish to acknowledge the collaborative organizers of the dialogue tonight from our sister institutions, Dr. Siphokazi Magadla from Rhodes University, Dr. Atambile Masola from University of Pretoria, as well as Dr. Babalwa Makoqana who is the interim director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies here at Nelson Mandela University. But I also want to acknowledge the unfailing and very outstanding work of the staff and students of the center. It is a young center and it is really indeed punching above its weight. I also want to acknowledge Professor Sarah Muswetsa, who is the CEO of the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, and also to just thank her for her support of our work and for her service to the field of humanities. I'm also informed that in our audience in this dialogue, present are some of the stalwarts, the women who were part of that delegation to Beijing more than 25 years ago. We thank all of you for making time to be here today. A fight for gender equality remains pivotal, and the impact of gender inequality permeates and defies class and nationalities. It remains a debilitating reality within the homes and makes itself felt daily in the public spaces where we as women work and lead. I am grateful to be able to welcome you all who are watching and participating in this webinar across the globe. As one world, we are still facing the very real health challenge of the coronavirus pandemic. COVID-19 has redefined our social relations. It has compressed geography and time, allowing us to converse in the private spaces of our homes, but for many, their precarity has deepened, with many losing homes and losing shelter, and poverty has been exacerbated and vulnerability has increased. The timing of the Beijing Plus 25 review coincides with a similar review recently undertaken of the 5-year milestone of democracy here in South Africa. It will be interesting for me to draw comparisons in this regard, especially as this relates to advances in gender equality. Monday, the 8th of March, as you all know, marked the International Women's Day. Yesterday, the 21st March, here in South Africa, we celebrated the Human Rights Day. This day is marked as the day of commemorating those who lost their lives in the Sharpeville massacre on the 21st of March, 60 years ago, while demanding their rights not to carry identity passes as enforced by the apartheid state of the time. The legacy of this institutionalized violence born out of racialized inequalities under an illegitimate and undemocratic government of the time continues today to pose a challenge as we seek deeper understanding of the many proxies of inequality, with gendered inequality and gender-based harm being one of the most persistent and stubborn of the scourges that continue to face our society today. Given these histories of the intersecting inequalities in our country, today's reflections on the legacies of the 4th United Nations World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, in September 1995, by those who were part of this area is extremely significant. The 4th Beijing Conference was indeed a watershed moment in forging a global agenda towards the achievement of gender equality. 17,000 delegates and 30,000 activists from across the globe streamed to Beijing to attend the 4th World Women's Conference. This remains one of the largest meetings and gatherings to promote women's rights ever held. What emerged as the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was endorsed by 189 countries. It identified 12 key areas, including education, poverty, health, conflict, economy, and power and decision-making, among others, to inform policy measures that could facilitate the eradication of gendered inequality. The Beijing Platform for Action remains positioned as one of the strongest commitments to women's human rights in the ongoing struggle for a sustainable and a just world. While some may argue that significant inroads have been made in terms of the achievement of legislative equality for women and girls globally in the 25 years after the Beijing conference, no country has achieved gender equality. And I quote Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka, as she noted in her 2015 report on 20 years of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. I imagine that Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka, and as well as the rest of our panel, will be reflecting on these thoughts during our discussions this evening. Waves of movements against sexual violence and femicide from South Africa, Chile, Mexico and United States, Nigeria and Kenya, for example, show that physical security in private and public spaces remains an elusive goal for most women and girls. The global increase of gender-based violence during COVID-19 lockdown moment in many countries is reflective of the continued reality that for women and girls, equality is yet to be achieved. As I move to conclude, Program Director, for us in the higher education sector in South Africa and in our continent, this dialogue has come at an opportune time. Our public universities in South Africa here, our 26 of them, have increasing numbers of female students, constituting up to 58.5% of the student population of our public universities. This environment requires that we pause and reflect on how we challenge the deep-seated and fundamental gender inequalities that persist in our education through the curriculum, through the research decisions that we make and the programs that we choose and the areas of study that we choose to pursue. And also, it does continue in some of the ways in which we engage communities around us. Therefore, as we reflect tonight, we also ought to go beyond the institutionalized experiences in dealing with gender questions and speak to the everyday challenges of the queer and broader marginalized communities struggling with intersecting gender challenges. I want to thank you for taking time to participate in this dialogue. It is interactions such as this which are also playing a pivotal role in our intentions here at Nelson Mandela University to recenter humanities. Your contributions will, and I'm sure, and I'm confident that they will take us a step forward towards a concrete articulation of this vision that we have. Again, colleagues, friends, students, and members of the public, our distinguished guests, I welcome you to this dialogue, which bring all of us together to reflect and take stock on the current gender questions facing us all. I'm convinced that this dialogue is a small, but it is a significant step towards improvement of the human condition globally, something that cannot be achieved without securing gender equality as a necessary precondition. I thank you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mutwa, for the warm welcome that you have just rendered for us. Evening, colleagues, friends of the university, students, our collaborators, our partners, and all the people watching across different continents through different online platforms. My name is Babalwa Makokwana. I am the Interim Director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. Before I make short contextualization, Chair of the dialogue in South Africa, let me first acknowledge the dignitaries in the presence, in our presence today, especially from Nelson Mandela University, the Chancellor, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, the Chair of Nelson Mandela University Council, Ambassador Nozipho January Badel, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, Professor Andre Kiet, the Deputy Vice Chancellor on Engagement and Transformation, Mr. Lebohang Hashatse, the DVC for People and Operations, Professor Cheryl Foxcroft, the DVC for Learning and Teaching, Dr. Tandim Gwebi, I see her on attendees, the DVC for Research and Innovation. Please allow me also to acknowledge Professor Pamela Maseko, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Nelson Mandela University, Professor Pumla Qola, the Sachi Chair for African Feminist Imaginations at Nelson Mandela University, Dr. Laura Best, providing support for the Office of the Vice Chancellor. From our partners, I would like to also acknowledge the DVC for Academic and Student Affairs from Rhodes University, Dr. Mabokang Monapula Mapesela, the Dean of Faculty of Humanities at Rhodes University, Prof. Innocent Msindo, the HOD in Politics and International Studies at Rhodes, Dr. Sally Matthews, and the Registrar, Dr. Adele Modley. I would also like to acknowledge our special guest from our partner institutions, Professor Sarah Muswetsa, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences in South Africa. Chair, we have special guests tonight who are not speaking though, but represented and organized South African women for the Beijing conference. Some of them will be joining us later, but most of them have RSVP'd. This includes Prague's governor, the women's rights activist, Mamlula Matlungwana, former South African Minister of Women, Youth, Children, and People with Disabilities, Mam Bridget Mabandla, former Minister of South African Justice and Constitutional Development, Mavivi Mnyakayaga Manzini, former Commissioner to Namibia and Deputy President for ANC Women's League, Ms. Dipuo Mvelase, former Deputy Chairperson of the South African Communist Party, Mambale Gambete, former Speaker of the South African National Assembly. There are many of them who attended this conference, but thanks to Mam Tenjwa Mtinso, we're able to track some of them. Chair, also allow me to recognize the organizing team of this dialogue. From the Center of Women and Gender Studies, Wendy Asi, Penom Tajubase, Thomas Ponso Tembiziko Vuvutlengiwe, our partners and collaborators, sisters and comrades, Dr. Spoga Zimagadla and Dr. Atambile Masola, the UN Women team, Alison, Erin, and Naduska. Thanks for having brief meetings with us up until this moment. Most importantly, Chair, let me recognize the speakers for tonight. From the United Nations Women, the Executive Director, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, Ambassador of the Republic of South Africa to Spain, Mamtenjwa Mtinso, Dr. Beverly Palesa Ditsi, the first LGBTI member to address the UN Beijing conference in 1995. Before I read the biography of our moderator, Prof. Yolande Buka, let me just acknowledge that last night we were all shocked by the passing of the global feminist giant, a novelist and an Egyptian scholar, Dr. Nawal El-Saadawi. She gained her new status among the African feminist ancestors at the age of 89, having written more than 50 books, among them well-known titled Women and Sex, Women from Point Zero, and many others, mostly around sexual rights, rape, religion. She was jailed for her daring the religion where she was based in Egypt in advocating for women's rights and gender equality in society. May her soul rest in peace. Indeed, we are standing on the shoulders of the giants. I am privileged to stand here today in recognition of the work that was done by those who have gone before us. But also, I must say, I am left with many questions at the levels of contradictions and complex realities faced by the younger generation of women and queer communities today in Africa. The Constitution of South Africa has been hailed as one of the most advanced in the world, given its recognition of the work done by the feminist elders in this room today. This has helped to increase the representation of women in public leadership spaces, but without minimizing the gains of our constitutional democracy in South Africa. Currently, we are faced with enduring racialized, gendered inequalities that tend to crisscross on the poor, young African women from the rural and peri-urban areas. We are faced with enduring and paralyzing fear of violence as femicide, sexual violence, and sexual harassment has become the order of the day. Even though this tends to create cynicism about our democracy, I am hopeful today that we will begin to speak on the intergenerational links and continuities that were presented by the group of the South African women in this historical conference. But also, I think that we must not just celebrate as we reflect this historic moment. We must go beyond statistics of women in power and focus on the quality of life for poor women, queer communities, and the continued unequal relations sometimes experienced within the global South countries themselves. Today, as the Vice Chancellor has already said, we are celebrating human rights in South Africa, commemorating 61 years of Sharpeville massacre, where 69 Black protesters who demanded freedom from carrying the passes were gunned down by the apartheid government. As we remember not to ever become that brutal society again, we must remember this context had a multi-layered meaning for the rights to move for women. On top of carrying the passes, women needed permission from the husbands, apartheid commissioners, and their white maidens to move freely. As we celebrate human rights and revisiting the legacies of this historic conference, I find Mam Phyllis Ndandala's assertion still true when she says, and I quote, "It is one of the ironies of history that the most pervasive and total oppression, the oppression of women, has been to a large extent neglected by scholars within the ranks of the liberation movement. This can be explained in part by the male chauvinism, which has been the bane of colonial liberation movements, and also the imprecise terms in which we discuss the future socio-economic order we envisage for a free South Africa. And yet, the success or otherwise of our struggle may depend on the extent to which we are able to involve as wide as possible a front of liberation forces against the oppressor regime. Women, especially the Black women, will and must form a central pillar of such a front. We submit, Black women have no cause to commit themselves totally to the liberation struggle unless the freedom to be achieved will in turn grant them equality and human dignity." She wrote these words in 1984, but they still feel fresh as yesterday. Colleagues, friends, and students, please help me to welcome Professor Yolande Buka, the moderator, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. Her research and teaching focus on gender, African politics and security, political violence, and field research ethics is conflict-afflicted in conflict-afflicted society. She holds a PhD in international relations from American University. Her current research is a multi-sited historical and political analysis of female competence in Southern Africa. Her previous research, which is now a book manuscript titled "In the Shadow of Prison: Power, Identity, and Transitional Justice in post-genocide Rwanda, focuses on the social and political impacts of the power-laden nature of the Rwandan Transitional Justice Program. Her research has received support from Fulbright Scholar Program and the American Association of University of Women. Prior to joining Queen's University, she was a visiting assistant professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Denver. In addition to her academic work, she has extensive experience with development and security research agencies. She has worked with and offered support to USAID, the UK Department of International Development, the United Nations, the African Union, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the United States Institute of Peace. Between 2014 and 2016, she was a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in the Conflict Prevention and Risk Analysis Division in Nairobi, Kenya, where she led research on peace and security, Africa's Great Lakes region. She currently serves on the Research Advisory Council, the Resolve Network, a global consortium of researchers, research organizations, policymakers, and practitioners committed to empirically driven, locally defined research on the drivers of violent extremism and sources of community resilience. Thank you, colleagues. Please help me to welcome our friend and a colleague, Professor Yolande Buka.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, distinguished guests, all protocols observed. I am happy to welcome you to the celebration of the legacies of the 25 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. I have to say that it's an honor and a privilege to be with you today and to have the opportunity to moderate this dialogue, for us to reflect on the progress made and the road ahead a quarter of a century later. Whenever I say a quarter of a century, it always seems a little bit heavier than 25 years, because we see the road that we have traveled on this path to gender equality. As a young scholar and a feminist, this conversation is a wonderful opportunity to learn from extraordinary feminists who are amongst the pillars of the African women's movement. So without further delays, let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists this evening. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka is United Nations Undersecretary General and Executive Director of UN Women. She was sworn into office on 19 August 2013 and brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this position, having devoted her career to issues of human rights, equality, and social justice. Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka has worked in government and civil society and with the private sector, and was actively involved in the struggle to end apartheid in her home country of South Africa. From 2005 to 2008, she served as Deputy President of South Africa, overseeing programs to combat poverty and bring the advantages of a growing economy to the poor, with a particular focus on women. Prior to this, she served as Minister of Mineral and Energy from 1999 to 2005 and Deputy Minister in the Department of Trade and Industry from 1996 to 1999. She was a member of Parliament from 1994 to 1996 as part of South Africa's first democratic government. Dr. Mlambo-Ngcuka began her career as a teacher and gained international experience as coordinator of the World YWCA in Geneva, where she established a global program for young women. She is the founder of Umlambo Foundation, which supports leadership and education. A longtime champion of women's rights, she is affiliated with several organizations devoted to education, women's empowerment, and gender equality. She has completed her PhD in Education and Technology at the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Welcome. I also want to introduce you to Ambassador Thenjiwe Mtintso, who is South Africa's ambassador to Spain. She was born in Orlando East, Soweto. In 1973, she was a student at Fort Hare University and a member of the South African Student Organization, which led to her expulsion from Fort Hare. From 1973 to 1976, she was an active member of the Black People's Convention. From 1975 to 1976, she worked as a journalist for the Daily Dispatch newspaper and was an active member of the Union of Black Journalists. Her activism led to multiple police detentions, torture, and banishment to Orlando East, Soweto in 1976 to 1978. She left South Africa for exile in 1978 until 1992, where she held various positions within the African National Congress and its armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, and South Africa's Communist Party in Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, Uganda, and Zambia. From 1985 to 1992, she was the ANC chief representative in Uganda and acted as the regional MK commander. In 1992 to 1994, she participated in the negotiation process under the Convention for a Democratic South Africa and the Transitional Executive Committee. She became a member of parliament in 1994, and from 1996 to 1998, she became South Africa's first chairperson to the Commission on Gender Equality. In 1997, she served as a founding member and chairperson of Gender Links, and has served as a member of its board and as an associate member since. Dr. Bev Palisa Ditse is a radical gender nonconforming lesbian activist, an award-winning filmmaker, a musician, spiritual healer, and warrior who was instrumental in bringing LGBTIQ+ rights into focus in the late 1980s and 1990s in South Africa and around the world. She is the first of many things, but is best known for being the first African lesbian to address the United Nations at the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. Which is the subject of the latest documentary, Lesbians Free Everyone, filmed entirely during this global lockdown of 2020. Her mission is simple: to change narratives that uphold patriarchy through the erasure and the misrepresentation of the feminine in history. Through her activism, her mission has been to undo the lies and simply tell her story. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome for their willingness to join us today. I will invite them to turn on their cameras so that everyone can see them. And we're going to start and jump right into the questions for today. I'm going to start with Dr. Mlabonduka. At the time of the Beijing conference, you were a member of parliament after years in teaching and gender and development. I want you to think and maybe walk us through what you remember were the local and global social political about women and gender equality at the time that led to the Beijing conference.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And I'd like to greet the leadership of Nelson Mandela University and all the other collaborating university. And thank you warmly for inviting us. And I'd like to greet my friend, Tenjin and Tinto. It's lovely to see her, and Tenjo and Betty. And really welcome this opportunity to have this conversation right at home. The Beijing conference in 1995 came after preparations that took 20 years. As it's called, the 4th International Conference on Women. The first conference was in Mexico. 5 years later, there was one in Copenhagen. 5 years later, there was one in Nairobi, and then there was one in Beijing. And the reason why it took so long, the global environment for gender equality was not enabling. Member states who were the custodians of this conference, who were being pushed by civil society to make significant progress, were arguing amongst themselves. So fast track to Beijing, where women came in their numbers to protect the deliberations on the conference, to push for progress to happen, because the lessons that we've learned is that if women don't show up, protect things just don't happen. And in Beijing, lo and behold, that is what happened. And that is how we ended up with such a comprehensive outcome, which Beijing Platform for Action is. And I have to say, very proud of South Africa, because you remember at that time, 1995 in South Africa, we just had become a new democratic dispensation. We were so ambitious, so optimistic. Our delegation and the delegation from Africa in general went there determined to push for change. And one of the biggest takeaways from me from the African delegation is how that delegation fought for the rights of the girl child. It was Africa who put on the agenda the definition of a child, which is not just child, but girl child. And through that, was able to highlight the specific challenges that are faced by a child who is a girl, which is child marriage, female genital mutilation, exclusion from education. And that has really helped us to this day, talking to you in an academic institution, to see so many girls enrolling and staying in schools, because the women in Africa fought so hard to have this as one of the centerpiece of the Beijing Platform for Action.
Thank you. You bring very key aspects when you're talking about the debate and the disputes that were happening, and Beijing being a platform not only to protect the progress made, but also to think about progress to be made. And one thing that you also highlight is the role of the African delegations, which seem to often be erased when we think about the genealogy of some of these conventions. So, Ambassador, you were involved in representing the ANC and MK in various functions. When you're thinking about the role that African women played on the platform of Beijing, what are your memories, working with government and security agencies, about the climate around the Beijing conference?
Thank you very much, Program Director, and thank you very much to all the esteemed guests. I must start by doing what South Africans do, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to then say that when I looked at the list and when the names were being read, oh, Dr. Banbani, Professor so-and-so, UN Women, Tonton, I got a fright. In fact, I was tempted to run away, because you can always run away from these platforms and say connectivity. So I didn't run away. I think that just to add to what Phumzile has said, one of the things was that from 1975 to 1985, that was the decade for women. So one of the backgrounds was that we're on this decade and we were quite impatient as gender activists, as women, as feminists, as progressives, as to what is happening. So you then have Beijing. This is why we were actually not just there. We were angry women. Even those that went, when we gave them what we say in Xhosa, ukuthi ningabayeki pha. The other side of it was, if you look at the debates, we were moving from what was then called women in development, women and development, and then gender and development. So there were all these things. And when we were talking in South Africa, some of the women were saying that, you know what, in development, out of the development, under development, what we want is freedom now. And then in Africa, there was a lot of activism that had started prior to 1995, especially around POW. And the women's movement was very, very strong. But we have to say that one of the challenges, which probably we'll talk about later, is that even as Africans, our view of patriarchy and our experience of patriarchy was quite differentiated. And some of us, as women of Africa or women from Africa, were relatively conservative. And in South Africa and in Africa and the whole, there was a tendency, which still continues today, of male streaming gender rather than mainstreaming, which then means then that because you want to be gender correct or politically correct, you put a sentence there about women, gender, violence against women. So just attach something so that you are seen to be progressive. And at that time, this was on the rise, this thing of male streaming gender and not mainstreaming it. So as we were going to Beijing, especially those of us who were in the ANC and its alliance, were quite sensitive that we must not mainstream, we must mainstream, and you must understand this notion of mainstreaming. And we were also quite impatient because the CEDAW, the reports that were coming even from South Africa, we found that our reports are not as strong as they should have been. But in Africa as a whole, you found that people were not taking CEDAW seriously. So Beijing was a moment where we felt that, you know what, we've got to really change the attitudes. And I think that Pumzile is right. One of the takeaways was the girl child. The other takeaway was the very definition of women's rights as human rights, because this was questionable across cultures and across religions and all that kind of thing. So you can see that for us, the question of going to, let me just add, for South Africa, we had just come back from exile and we'd just been freed, 1994, we'd freed ourselves. But when we went to CODESA, lo behold, the men, including the men of the African National Congress, were quite clear that, hey, of liberation and equality, you probably can go back home now, because when you were in the struggle, especially in MK, when you were in the struggle, it was abnormal situation. Now we're back to normal. So we are in a kitchen, normal. That thing of holding arms, of carrying arms and fighting was abnormal. Can be normal, guys. A kitchen. It was not said in so many words, but it was like that. This is why even at CODESA, I think Mavivi and other veterans are here. Even at CODESA, we had to fight for inclusion in CODESA. And thanks to the to the National Women's Coalition that had to be formed to then say that nothing about us without us. So that constitution is going to have a gender perspective. And all these were the background towards going to Beijing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this comprehensive overview and to look at how things were perceived, particularly after fighting for freedom within your own country. I hear you when you talk about angry women, coming to Beijing because of the long history of oppression that African women had endured. I'm thinking if we're looking 25 years back and thinking about how conservative, even within the feminist movement, things were. Dr. Diti, tell us a little bit about your own positionality as an LGBTQ activist at the height of these debates in the 1990s.
Good afternoon, honorable members. Good afternoon to my elders. Thank you, Program Director. I am really honored to be here, and thank you to the Nelson Mandela University for even inviting me. As Madam Ambassador said, Naminga when I see all the professors, and I think, oh my goodness, even my political language might be a little bit off, but I am so honored to be here, to be amongst all of us. In the early 90s, I had been a young activist, a student activist in my school, and my activism really started as a child, remembering the 76 uprisings. But in 86, I became someone who joined the SRC in my high school. And in my high school, as someone who was already out as a queer woman, I began to understand that, I think as Madam Ambassador also said, the young men were already talking about how when we achieve our masculinity, which had been, as we were emasculated under apartheid, women will go back to being women. And this thing here new, as you're speaking about sexuality and homosexuality and lesbians, ayikho le nto yonke, we are going to go back to normal. I became a co-chairperson of GLOW, GLOW being the gay and lesbian organization of Witwatersrand, in I think 92. And even as being a member of GLOW, began slowly to understand that even though I fit because we were fighting all the fights, we were not just there for queer issues. We were there as a non-racial, non-sexist, non-homophobic organization that was also fighting for all equality and wanted to be included in the constitution of the country. And so that is where our lobbying was. But from a lesbian point of view, I began to understand that lesbian rights were not being spoken of as human rights. This is not a conversation that was being had in the queer space, in the gay and lesbian organization. And it became very clear every time I wanted to attend, and many of us who were lesbians in the organization wanted to attend any feminist or any women's meetings, there would always be a bit of an issue because the question would be, what does that have to do with queer issues? I attended quite a few women's health program, women's health organization type events. I attended quite a few of these organizations. I attended quite a few of these events at the time, speaking about lesbian rights as being part of women's rights. But then the conflict within my own organization, when it emerged, whether consciously or unconsciously, I began to understand that even amongst gay men, patriarchy rules. Because even amongst us, there was a kind of the misconception that still exists is that as lesbians, we are trying to be men. And if we are attempting to be men, how then do we fit into a women's space or into a women's organization? Because, I then understood that our lives as women, we do not own our sexuality, that our sexuality is relational, that it must be in relation to men. And so my arrival at the Beijing conference was under the auspices of a gay and lesbian international organization called IGLHERC at the time, International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, who then made sure that there was representation coming from all over the world. And I was one of the fortunate people to have met these activists from other parts of the world who then said, why don't we have enough African representation coming in, particularly dealing with issues of sexuality, sexual autonomy. And that is how I arrived in Beijing and I arrived at the NGO conference and found over 30,000 amazing, incredible women who were activists in the space, and also learned, of course, about the United Nations, the formal, in the formal building in Beijing itself. And we had these different tents, and amongst them was the lesbian tent. And I think for the first time in my life, I found that I had language to articulate my frustration, even amongst my own colleagues in the gay and lesbian movement who did not understand women's rights as lesbian rights, as women's rights, which are human rights. And so that was just one added step in the fight, in the struggle, because even in the space itself, we had to fight for the space, for that to be recognized, for lesbian rights to be recognized as women's rights.
Thank you. I hear a theme here of what was expected of women after 1994 in South Africa. You can go back to the kitchen. You can go back to things being normal. And now I'm wondering, you did not go back to things being normal. You decided to keep pushing and go to a place like Beijing and continue to advocate. But, let's think about what it meant for you at the time and what it means for you today. this platform, this declaration, almost being in opposition of what was expected of you. Dr. Pumzile, can you speak a little bit about what it meant for you once it was signed and what it was put into action at the time?
Just picking up on what Ambassador Tinto said about women's rights being human rights, and moving away from just lumping women's issues as development issues, sort of charity issues. That was a very pivotal moment because it meant that governments had to enact legislation so that women's rights were codified. Because in many countries, there wasn't even laws that protected women. So if women were in any way if their rights were violated, they didn't have easy recourse in law. Starting from Beijing, we began to see countries beginning to, of course, some countries did have laws, but the bulk number of countries didn't. And what Beijing did was to create a platform to which everyone was accountable to. All women, wherever they come from, had to be treated the same. And this was the standard that Beijing provided, that the Beijing platform provided. And countries then had to go and pass national legislation in line with the Beijing Declaration. And that began to give effect to the notion that women's rights are human rights. The world didn't have much gender jurisprudence at the time. It evolved in the last 25 years. If Me Too had happened 25 years ago, it would not have been as successful as it was now. These big chiefs that are violators who normally would get away with the crime would have gotten away with it at that time. And even now, if we didn't have this platform that gives women the possibility to go to laws and to hold these people accountable. So this was a real game changer. But important as this was, it did not come with clear investments to say, how are you going to afford this? How are the countries that are already reluctant to implement and advance gender equality going to be inspired to take steps and to do something about gender equality? It also did not come with measures to reinforce and to hold the countries accountable. And certainly it did not recognize fully girls in their diversity. The point that Bev is making, that they were women who were meant to be just one specific monolithic group of people. Any other woman who was not heterosexual was therefore not counted as women. So over the last 25 years, we've also been fighting to make sure that we broaden this definition. But guess what, Madam Director, as I speak now, we are having a crisis in Turkey because the Turkish government has pulled out of the Istanbul Convention, which is the most comprehensive convention in the world on ending violence against women. It was even signed and adopted in Turkey, which is where Istanbul is, which is why it's called Istanbul. And one of the reasons they are citing for pulling out of this convention is that this convention promotes homosexuality. You know, and then you say, wow, we've come this far and this is where we are. So, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We must celebrate the progress we make, but we have to be conscious of the fact that the fight is not over. We have so much else to continue to fight for.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. I am reminded constantly that no matter what kind of progress the women's movement is able to make, we also have to be careful to conserve and preserve the progress, because at any moment the backlash can lead to loss of some of the privileges and the rights we've been able to gain. Let me ask you, Ambassador, as someone who in fact was for a very long time outside of the ordinary or the traditional space of women, when that declaration was signed, when the platform of action was adopted, what did it mean for you as a woman in your position?
Well, thank you very much. Probably I'd have to ask, how many days do we have to just talk about this aspect? I think that one of the first things is to say, for me personally, it was a wow. It was a wow moment, because I was tracing what had been happening prior to 1995, as we had said earlier. So that it was a sense of achievement. One knew that it was just but a plateau, but it was a turning point. And I can say that in terms of gender struggles and feminism, we could write our story as before Beijing and after Beijing. I know, as Phumzile said, that there's a long road still ahead of us. There was also this sense of sisterhood and solidarity amongst gender activists, amongst women, even amongst the gay and lesbians. I remember going on a march together with the Glow movement in Hillbrow. It was just that sense that we were in this thing together. So you had that. But even as it was a sense of sisterhood, Beijing also brought about a deeper understanding, I think, amongst us gender activists and feminists of whatever hue, of there is no universal sisterhood. At that time, we used to talk about this sisterhood, and there was this euphoria of 1994, but we began to understand there's no universal sisterhood. But even as there's no universal sisterhood, there was so much that could unite us and the issues that we could unite around. This is why the Beijing platform of action was quite important. The second aspect, and I'll tell here a story, and they didn't tell me, they didn't want you, I'm a storyteller. It was also in that sisterhood syndrome, and especially for the African and Black feminists, we went to a rural area with Meruth, may her soul rest in peace. And we were telling women in this rural area that you must get out of the kitchen. Now Beijing has given you all the rights. We are now free. And these women looked at us and said, "Niyabona ke nina? Njengoba nifuna uphume ekitchen nje, phumani ekitchen, nisinike ela kitchen thina, asikabi nalo nekitchen. Sisafuna ikitchen." So the question of the practical gender needs and the strategic gender needs were brought to the fore by that Beijing, that many women are still fighting for very practical things, just a man's access to water, and going to fetch water for them and getting taps was going to be one of the things. So it was quite a wow for me. It also gave hope. I think that Phumzile has covered this, in that now governments had tools, and individually you knew and understood your rights. Whereas previously you could have been quite vague about and you would know as women, many women, that but you are not quite sure how to explain no some short. Where is it shorting? But with Beijing, you could actually have that instrument and then say that it is shorting here in the economy and all the 12 critical areas that were underlined. But at a practical level, also it was a beautiful moment because we had the language and discourse. At that time, many people were not going to be using terms like patriarchy. Hey, patriarchy. But we could, as women and gender activists, especially in my organization, you could see men trying to self-correct that arrogance of before Beijing. You would then hear them saying that, hey, lo mcimbi wase Beijing. So before they say anything very negative, they think of, hey, was a Beijing. So they've got to self-correct and look at their language. And some of them began, even if it was opportunistically, to talk about patriarchy and remove themselves from this derogatory language. And it actually brought to fore one of the things that was quite denialist in the government and the state of that time, when some of us in some platforms said, you know that South Africa is a patriarchal state. And people were surprised, how do you say a patriarchal state in 1995 when we've just had our liberation? So this understanding of patriarchy taking the colors and the forms of democracy and appropriating them and using. So you could actually say that, yes, it's democratic patriarchy, but patriarchy, you're not, you're a patriarchy. So we were actually helped by Beijing. And I want to say that lastly, for me and many women, Beijing was a weapon. When things went wrong, you just went back and said, yeah, Beijing didn't agree on this, you know. So you could use it as a weapon for attack and for defense. And it was a toolbox, and it remains a toolbox. You had within that all the kinds of instruments that you could take and use and polish and reuse. So that toolbox still remains very important. We can add more tools inside as we are talking about LGBTIQ+. We can add other tools as we're talking about climate change, but the toolbox is there. We can sharpen some of the tools and we can add other tools. For that action plan, for me, remains. And I'm of course one of those direct beneficiaries, I must confess, because then after Beijing, there was the gender machinery, and then there was gender commission, and I was lucky enough to be the chair of the gender commission. So I'm a beneficiary directly of was a Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you. This is fantastic. And I love the stories because I think it helps us contextualize and put texture to the trajectory of this document and the impact that it had domestically, but also personally for the people who were involved. Something that you mentioned was the limits of this universal sisterhood. So once the toolkit is developed, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ditsi, how you felt as an activist once a platform was put in place in terms of the limits of the sisterhood. Did you feel that as well? And did you feel like the toolbox addressed all the needs that you had at the time?
Thank you. My experience of Beijing was mainly while there was excitement and the solidarity that my elders speak of, which was quite incredible. We had a lesbian march at the NGO forum and realized that it swelled and swelled, and realized that many of the people, many of the women there were not even those who identified as lesbians, but coming from all these different organizations in an understanding of the importance of one's sexual autonomy as a woman. And so coming from where I was coming from, where lesbian rights were not spoken of as women's rights, and being in that space was quite incredible. And the platform for action really shook things. One of my other experiences was of the hostility and fear in the space, because we did get accosted a lot. We did, in fact, get a lot of people. In the corridors of the UN building, we had these round badges that said lesbian rights are women's rights. And all of us who were walking around with that have an experience of either being pushed, being spat at, particularly by mostly either the Vatican or the Muslim countries. We had different people really threatening our physical bodies, our physicalness in the space. And the debates themselves were really fierce. or when it came to all the issues that affect us, whether you were talking about termination of pregnancy, or whether you were talking about female genital mutilation, where I would hear different members in the space saying that the United Nations, particularly the Platform for Action, is attempting to erode the autonomy of the states, of the different states. Because obviously, if this is either a religious state in whatever way, or if it goes against whatever their traditions and cultures, and therefore they will not be dictated to by this document. And so it was really, for me, exciting. I was young, I was 22, 23 years old. It was exciting while it was quite frightening at the same time to really see how what for me is a simple matter of human rights, is a simple matter of my safety as somebody who is growing up in Orlando West. I know Mom Tenjiwe, Ambassador Tenjiwe comes from Orlando East. Go Orlando West, I was facing all kinds of issues. Being constantly threatened and being constantly told that we're going to teach you you're a woman, because again, woman is relational. You have to have a man in order to prove that you're a woman. And so coming from this space, and then it was simple for me. Issue of sexual orientation and sexual autonomy was a very simple one, but it turns out that it was not so simple. And so even when I made the speech, I would like to just read this quickly. In the Platform for Action, sexual orientation was in brackets. And so you have wording like this: the human rights of women are inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of universal human rights, and must therefore be promoted, protected, and realized at all stages of the life cycle: childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age, and must further reflect the full diversity of women, recognizing that many women face additional barriers because of such factors as their race, language, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic class or status as indigenous people, migrants, displaced people, or refugees, and it goes on. Sexual orientation was in brackets. And where the group that I was with, which was the Lesbian Caucus in the space, was fighting for the inclusion of the word sexual orientation, because this is amongst all of these factors, one of the other factors that we are discriminated against as women. And this fight became a ferocious war that went on until the very last day. And it reminded us, and we constantly speak of this as, you know, how a lot of the time when you are in a SRC meeting, or you are in all these different meetings, when you have the item on the agenda called women's issues would always be number 9 on the agenda. And it would happen right as the meeting is about to end, and everyone is just so tired and they don't want to deal with women's issues, which is sitting at the bottom of the agenda. Sexual orientation at Beijing happened like that. The very last issue to be debated, started happening about 11 p.m. on the last night. People were leaving, they had packed the very next morning, and it went on this debate until about 3 o'clock in the morning. And it did not pass. Eventually, the word sexual orientation were removed. Instead, we have it's called paragraph 96, equal relationships between women and men in matters of sexual relations and reproduction, including full respect of the integrity of the person. Require mutual respect, consent, and shared responsibility for sexual behavior and its consequences. Those are the words we end up with. And so the Platform for Action is one that is used as a blueprint, because we are happy that even the words sexuality, sexual and reproductive health made it into the Platform for Action. Because if there wasn't the fight, if we didn't fight as hard as we did, it wouldn't have been there. And the fact that it is there means that we have a blueprint and something that we are using constantly in all our interactions, whether it is at the African Commission for Human and People's Rights or at the Human Rights Council, wherever it is, we're able to then refer back. Unfortunately, how it translates on the ground is a completely different story, and I'm sure we will keep, we are having these conversations. How it translates is very differently. And we do need to deal with how patriarchy operates in order to ensure that we are not able to even use these documents that we have that are such wonderful documents, that we are still unable to really implement that affect people on the ground.
Thank you. I think what you've described is really the labor of love that is necessary in order to really implement concepts of intersectionality or simultaneity that was developed, by many Black women around the world. But I think, for instance, about the Combahee Collective. I mean, what you've described is this type of work. Now, I think you're also segueing into the framework and how it's implemented on the ground. I want to ask the panelists today in this question, 25 years later, what is the continued role and legacy of this framework internationally, but also nationally? So we talked about this toolbox, we talked about this language, we talked about this framework, and the types of compromise that were necessary in order to achieve the documents as they are today. 25 years later, what is their continued role and legacies, and what is maybe the limitations of the framework as it was adopted? Dr. Pumzile?
The Beijing platform is this blueprint, if you like. It is what the UN Charter is to members of the UN. All of the UN members, they subscribe to the UN Charter. And that helps to keep this collection of member states in some form of collaborative relationship. And thank God, we have not had a member who has ever opted out of the United Nations, because can you just imagine, even if 2 or 3 or 4 would opt out, that would be a real crisis. Because even though this does not, the United Nations as an institution and the Charter as a mechanism does not force the will of the other states on the states that may act contrary, but it creates a mechanism to hold everyone together, some level of accountability. We would be worse without the Charter. The Beijing Platform for Action gives us that. It is comprehensive, it is the best of what we have, but it is not perfect. But without that platform, we'd be worse off. Thankfully, again, we did not have a country that has opted out of the platform. Instead, we have had more countries that have come on board, because in Beijing, there were 183 countries who adopted the declaration out of the 193 member states. And some of the countries have not formally adopted the Beijing Declaration, but now they actually report on their progress. In other words, they are part of the collective. When we demand reports from countries on what they are doing to implement the Beijing Declaration, like countries like Saudi Arabia, they voluntarily report, and so they want to be counted and they want to be guided by this. So that really helps us to maintain some coherence. But interesting enough, as Bev is saying, this issue of sexual orientation, even up to today, is still one of the most difficult things. I was surprised, Nami, when I came to work for the UN, at just how deep and divisive this issue is. The desire for men and for states to control women's bodies and to tell women about their identities, it is just amazing. I think the women's body is one of the most regulated being. You never hear people quibbling about men's wuzit and men's bodies the way they do about women's bodies. So as we speak now, for instance, we are discussing at CSW the agreed conclusions that get adopted at the end of the CSW. The issues that we are stuck around, more than any issue, are issues that have to do with women's sexuality. wherever we go. Inzima lento yalo mcimbi walo mzimba wamakhosikazi. It is just amazing. And then when you want to define yourself differently as a woman, Heike, it's even worse. So yes, the charter is important. It has some areas that need to be strengthened, but we're better off with than without. We've now decided to find a way of both expanding the participants and stakeholders in who are advancing gender equality by formulating something that is called generation equality, which is responding to the shortcomings in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and the shortcomings in terms of the issues that were not discussed in Beijing, issues like innovation and technology, issues that were not strongly emphasized, like climate change, but also issues that were left hanging, like the issue of sexuality. So generation equality could not be decided inside intergovernmental processes. It is not discussed inside the UN. We have had to form a multilateral extra outside the UN, but bring in all kinds of stakeholders so that people can speak freely and raise the level of ambition and name the things the way they should be named. And I will urge you to be part of generation equality. We've brought in young people, we've brought in private sector, we've brought in artists, everyone who cares for generation equality, but also because it's so broad, there are also areas where you cannot say we cohere, absolutely, but we are at least convinced about the need to take this issue of gender equality forward and in a more ambitious way. So generation equality kickoff will be in Mexico from the 28th to the 30th of March. And because most of it will be virtual on a platform like YouTube, for instance, you will be able to follow it. And then it will culminate in Paris in June from the 28th, from the 30th to the 2nd of 30th of June to the 2nd of July. And really, this is to give multilateral a shot in the arm, to say we are not the sum total of the disagreements of member states. We are something much bigger than that, much more diverse than that. Our aspirations are much bigger than what the member states want to disagree about. And we want to use generation equality to enhance the debate in the multilateral system so that we can really go to where angels don't dare to go, because otherwise we are not making the kind of progress that we deserve and that we need for gender equality to be complete.
I think we're absolutely privileged to have you in the room to not only make the link between what was done in the past, but also to think about how the UN and the women, the feminists in the UN are thinking in innovative ways to make progress on the declaration and maybe what the ways in which we can fill the gap. So thank you very much for this. So again, I'm asking the question to Ambassador now, Madam Ambassador. 25 years later, what do you think about the legacies and the ways in which it provides maybe a framework nationally or globally as you engage in the diplomatic circles, for instance? How do you see the role of the declaration and the platform in facilitating women's participation and representation and gender equality in your sphere of work?
Well, thank you very much. And I think that we should actually be happy as South Africa in general, but as women in particular, to have Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka there leading all these matters. In fact, I was saying to her, we should just have called her to just ask then we'll just follow. I think that one of the things that Beijing has really offered, as I've already said this, that it is this toolbox. And here in Spain, as the group of women ambassadors, we are using that very Beijing platform of action to discuss amongst ourselves, to check our own countries, even as we're preparing for this CSW. Some of the women gathered, of course, virtually, to then say that what is being taken to the CSW. And therefore, it's a very live document, and it's a very live platform of action, what's and all, with all its weaknesses. I was talking to Ambassador Mabanja, and I think that she gave me who was one of those that were there, actually, who was saying to me, you know that the Beijing platform of action, Tenji, is the spine of the agenda of the gender agenda. It's a spine, and you can imagine it as a spine that everything is held by that agenda, by that spine. So it continues to elevate women's issues and shaping the discourse. But it also continues to problematize, especially in South Africa, to problematize the quantitative representation. Because if you look at us as South Africa, especially in politics, quantitatively, we have almost made the 50-50. And both in parliament and in the cabinet and deputy ministers. So you see this quantitative leap. But what we've got to be answering is, why is it that when we are so advanced quantitatively in terms of our representation, we then have such high gender-based violence and femicide, which are the highest forms of patriarchy? And I think that when we are discussing CSW and we're discussing the Beijing platform of action, this is one of the things that we must continue asking ourselves. In the continent, the same, that the Beijing platform of action reinvigorated CSW. Remember that some of the countries were not even submitting proper reports in terms of the CSW. We then had milestones like the Maputo Protocol. We had the Gender Protocol of SADC, and the Africa Agenda 2063 aspirations, especially aspiration 3, 4, and 6, as well as just the gendered approach when you look at the whole of the Africa Agenda. So it has given us that basis. And I think one of the things that kept on happening, especially in South Africa, and I think it continues to happen even now, but of course I'm very old, I don't know these things. This thing of these waves of feminism. We had the first wave of feminism, the second wave of feminism. I don't know in which wave we are. And some of the younger feminists tend to overlook some of the things that have been done and the achievements that we've made, and tend to want to start from scratch when there are already these instruments that we have. And I agree with Phumzile with this question of the generation equality, but also the intergenerational, that we should actually know that we've got some of these things there at hand. All we need to do is to sharpen some of these weapons or add to some of these weapons, and not try to theorize because we want to be now in the 10th wave of feminism. Very important, the theory and practice. I'm not undermining that because I'm not educated, but I'm just thinking that we need to really lobby and galvanize ourselves. Whatever feminist we think we are, and in whatever way, put that together with activism, put that theory into practice so that even the practice can be informed by the theory. And sometimes I find this disjuncture amongst us, and it's something that had existed previously, the them and us. And in this generation, I think we should cut off, we don't have the luxury. Asile amadoda apha phandle, isile ipatriarchy, ikhohlakele ipatriarchy. So we can't afford, hey, I'm this socialist feminist. No, I'm that feminist. No, we can't afford that. We just need to fight patriarchy. And now the young people would actually say, hashtag patriarchy must fall. And if patriarchy is going to fall, we must unite. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, as an academic who is now starting to really gain a broader appreciation of the importance that activism has offered to my own work, I could not agree with you more. I think one of the challenges with waves is that it also has, unfortunately, a tendency to sometimes erase the labor of people who've come before. So if you have stronger links between those who want to intellectualize, but those who are also doing the work, I think that it is what is necessary in order to be able to achieve our goals. So, Dr.
Can I
Bear,
just say here?
please go ahead, jump in.
In fact, just to agree with Tenj, because I also feel very strongly about this point. One of the strong tenets of generation equality is that it is an intergenerational effort. We are bringing together those who have been there, who are the ones that were, for instance, in Beijing, and those that were not even born when we were in Beijing, and make sure that we forge common links and make sure that what unites us is what prevails more than what we disagree with. Because the significance of us uniting is much bigger than anything that we would see as a disagreement. And we acknowledge the fact that those on whose shoulders we stand have given us the building blocks that we have today. And those that are younger, that will be standing on our shoulders, have the capacity to see much further than some of us, Bokokzila, will be able to see. We will be the go-go's, and they'll be moving forward, and they can already see how far they have to go. And they have a completely different lived experience than us. So that on its own helps to fuse the difference and minimize the differences, because we are having to appreciate what we all bring into this equation. So intergenerational struggles are important. And bastrong abantwana shem abadlali, they have refreshing radical impatience. And that is helping for those of us who work with member states to create a sense of agency that sometimes masisihleli no single excellency izinto zihamba kancane. When you have the young people and the adolescent girls, they are just amazing. They are injecting a real sense of agency and helping us to move forward faster.
Mm-hmm. And just to add, for me, really, my opinion is that while I see how it is so easy to invalidate what was the first or the second or the third wave and what it was, what it isn't, is to recognize that there are so many things that we can learn. Because it's not like there hasn't been movements that have been attempting all sorts of different things. We don't see progress. As an activist, for me, making the film and talking to all the different participants who were in Beijing, and not recognizing at the time that actually we've made such strides that we don't see the strides, because we're just seeing just how bad it is. We're seeing the GBV, we are seeing all the violence against all the feminine people, whether they are gay, whether they are trans women. We are seeing all this violence, and we are not seeing the strides that make me have the ability to sit here today and even have this conversation. To have a film titled Lesbians Free Everyone, and the media speaks to me about this title as though, oh, this would not have happened 5 years ago. We need to be able to recognize the strides that we have made. But I would like to problematize representation, Madam Ambassador, for just 1 second. What we have started doing, or what I recognize that we are starting to do, is we are starting to replace systemic change with representation. we are beginning to learn from all the different waves as well, that just because we have a 50% in this particular space that's representing does not necessarily mean that there's systemic change. And so if systemic change is needed, perhaps the blueprint of this platform for action should then be used to find a different approach to the ending of patriarchy. Because for me, the book, the platform for action as a framework, has always been about ending gender inequality. And if that is all we've been doing and hitting all these ceilings and all these walls while we are attempting to do this, because we know very well how patriarchy is operating so wonderfully to make sure that we do not achieve this, whether they are doing that through economic disenfranchisement, whether they are doing that in all the different ways that it is happening, we are not able to really achieve where we want to achieve. And therefore, I think the book itself should be used, and we should have a different approach where we are saying, now that we know that we are not just going to end the inequality, because people who are in a position of power are not just going to give up their position of power just because they are being asked to give up their position of power. We know that that's not how this works. Therefore, how do we use this particular framework to say, all right, now we are coming from a different point of view. Now we are saying we need to find a way to end the system of patriarchy. How do we do that? That's what I would like to pose. That is where I am sitting. That's what I would like to see happen, where we are then investigating this.
Thank you. And I think this actually brings us to then, as we're thinking aspirationally, where do we go from here? I actually want to ask our panelists, this is going to be my last question since we need to wrap up, unfortunately. I'm drinking your knowledge and wisdom here. I want to ask you, where do we go from here? I've heard the word blueprint. Blueprint to go where? We know we have this objective of ending and abolishing the patriarchy. But what are the stops that are going to have to be made along the way? What if we are on a road trip driving and we use these declarations as a map or a blueprint to our destination? What are some of the goals that we need to achieve? And here I'm thinking about the struggles of femicides that are plaguing our societies around the world. You know, I think almost every country in the world has this problem. Women are more likely to die at the hand of their loved ones or men in their societies than any other cause of death. When we're thinking about the LGBTQ plus community in Ghana, for instance, I have the debate that have been going on in Ghana, but are the reality in many of our African countries. What are the milestones we need to achieve with this blueprint in order to achieve the goal that we have? Dr. Pumzile.
You know, this issue of representation, which happens to be the theme of CSW this year, because there is an illusion of progress as far as representation of women is concerned. This is because many women who are in positions work so hard that one woman looks like she's 5 people. And therefore we begin to imagine that we have increased significantly the representation of women. But I think Bev is right. It's not just representation for representation's sake. And this is now amongst us as women that we have to address this issue. The quality of the women we have to represent our issues, the importance of making sure that when we are in this position, we are not representing ourselves, we are representing the agenda, and we have to fight for it. When men get into these positions, they can afford to think that, you know, I'm here on my own and I'm just a cool dude. We don't have that luxury as women. We have to fight so much. So in South Africa, especially in politics, we are not that bad compared to many other countries. There is much more that we should be doing with the representation that we have. So I think now we are also in a phase when we have to be much harder on ourselves as representatives to do much more to deliver the change, and also those who are outside, not representative, to push, to assist, and to enable those who are in representative capacity to have an enabling environment for them to take our issues forward. So there's joint homework for those who are in positions and those who are supporters, consent people who are outside. Also, we continue to have a problem of women not being preferred as leaders by the electorate, including women. We need to work harder to get women voters to believe and support women voters, and to work jointly as electorate and those that are standing for positions to define what is it that we want to accomplish as a result of you being in this in this position. I also want to highlight the fact that we must not think all of this happens without investments. The limited investment on women's agenda by all governments and by society in general is quite a concern. We must continuously also call for channeling of resources in the direction of the women's program, women's initiatives, because the women's agenda is broke. And men are the majority of those who control the budgets and the passes, and therefore we need also to get men to take a stand on this issue, because this is also resources that belong to women. And when they do that, they obviously must not expect that they will be praised and be thanked for that, because they'll just be doing their job as public representatives. We are not going to thank fishes for swimming. So there is a joint and a collective responsibility for everyone to do their task. It's not only on women, it is on everybody, especially anyone who's in a representative capacity. You just cannot govern for men and advance patriarchy while you are in a position of authority.
Thank you. If you ask someone, if you want to know what someone's priorities are, you need to know how they're spending their money. And if women are indeed the priorities of our states, then they need to demonstrate that with the money they spend. Thank you. So I will move to Madam Ambassador. What are the stops we need to get to on this blueprint to get to ending the patriarchy? Madam Ambassador Mitso? Maybe your mic?
Okay, now I'm back. I'm not sure about the stops, and I guess one of the reasons that I'm not sure about the stops is that I've got fewer stops ahead because of my age. But I think that one of the things that we've got to do is to really invest on the youth in whatever way. We've got to invest, because we can't say the future is theirs and they don't build it now. I was quite excited when Phumzile was saying that the young people are such activists. And I think that we've got to invest in that, and what you are talking about earlier on. I just want to divert a little bit and refer to one of the things that Bev and earlier on were talking about, this question of LGBTIQ+. You know that even under progressives, as you were saying when Phumzile, here in Spain, it's supposed to be a progressive government of the socialists. And the minister, which is one of the things that probably as South Africa we can look at, instead of them having a ministry of women, the youth and the disabled, they've got the Ministry of Equality, which then is broader. And I think that, as you were saying, we must begin to problematize some of these things, Bev, that even when you talk about the Ministry of Women, you are limiting. Whereas now, if you are broadening the very definition of what should be happening under equality, so they've got this Ministry of Equality. And the second thing that this progressive minister does is to introduce a law, a very progressive law that is called transgender law. And this transgender law is to simply for people to simply and freely self-determine their gender without requiring medical or psychological or whatever it is that they require. And to ask companies to then say that to companies, they'll give them incentives, because here there's a lot of marginalization of the trans society. But it was feminists, it continues to be feminists that are against this movement. And I think that is one of those things that then when we talk about looking at that toolbox and sharpening our weapons to then say that even as South Africa, we can begin at government level to look at this, the Ministry or Department of Equality, so that we can broaden. I take the point of it's not enough, the quantitative representation, or even it may not even be the representation, it may be the quantitative presentation, because when the women go into government or in whatever structure, they say that I was not elected by women. I'm there in my own right. So I'm not accountable. I'm not representing women. I think what we should be looking at is the importance of access into whatever responsibility or position. Access is fundamental, but it is not the only thing that we require. So as we are looking at this generation and intergenerational, it's important that we should access singene ngeminyango, singene ngefestile, singene. And then patriarchy has got to deal with us at least at the quantitative level. That's one part. But it is not only about singene. We must participate, challenge, #challenge, whatever is there. Uzo challenge apa, uba diplomat. You've come to challenge the very sphere of diplomacy. So I'm just not, as a gender activist, feminist, or whatever I call myself, I'm not just there as a woman. I'm there to challenge. So that question of you must access, and then you must make sure that you participate. Because with that participation, I think that we would be well armed to then bring the transformation that you are talking about, Bev, that from the quantity to the qualitative change. And one of the things that we've got to be doing, even at the UN that Phumzile was talking about, there is a lot, and it's very important, the question of projects for women there, projects for women in Rwanda, projects for women in India, and all. These are very critical because it's part of the empowering of women. But we must make sure that in some way, we are also looking at the systemic challenges. I know it's easier said than done, because when you talk about, I don't want to be chased away, but you know, we've just buried the king, Phumzile, and Abafazi got a particular king, and king in Amafazi, you know. But of course, the challenge is that it's in our constitution, these structures. So how do we challenge the systemic patriarchy that goes with all these things? And I think that that's one of the things, Bev, that we need to be looking at as to how do we make this blueprint alive. I was so embarrassed, and I want to share this story. Last night, I asked my grandchildren, they are girls, and one of them has written a very beautiful poem about gender violence. One is 14, the other one is 16 and is in matric. So I was asking them, thinking that I'm going to be clever on this platform. Uguti, what do you think of the Beijing platform of action? But Beijing, Beijing, is it not in China? Why are you talking about Beijing platform of action? China. And I realized that some of us are failing to do the work, and we are going to end up just looking at quantitative. I'm proud that my granddaughter can recite these poems about gender-based violence, but she has no clue about patriarchy and how we've grown in this patriarchy and how we're changing it. So we've got to enter these spaces and use these spaces that we're at as tools to transform the very spaces. So we enter in the state, enter in the UN, and use the UN to transform the UN. We transform it and use it in that transformation because it has given you authority, it has given you some relative power, it has given you some platform. So must get in and hold those responsibilities, but use them. And we must not assume that all of us, because as Pumslo would say, because that automatically we are going to be very gender sensitive. We need to empower ourselves too. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bev, you have the concluding word before we move to the next stage of our conversation. So with regards to this blueprint and where we go from here.
I'm endorsing everything my elders have said, but to also say that we have institutions. We actually have the institutions that we need, that they exist. We have CGE, the Commission on Gender Equality. We have the Ministry of Women, the one that I agree that we need to probably look at the language and change this language in order to then remove the limitations. We have the South African Human Rights Commission. We have all these different commissions that exist. I'm finding out that the South African Human Rights Commission, I have a friend who worked in the commission who says that it seems as though the commission is not being used, particularly when it comes to gender inequality and issues around gender. That it is many of the issues that come are racial, and they are obviously coming from the other side where it is us, the Black people, that are being accused of the racism, that these tools exist and yet we are really not using them the way that I think that. And if the challenge here is that it is those representatives inside the institutions that are themselves not using them, they need to be challenged. As Madam Ambassador said, challenge, 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 challenge. But in all these different areas where I'm finding that we are not necessarily really using the resources that are there. Legally speaking, even the law is very disappointing in how it is being interpreted and how it is being used against women, just simply people on the ground who are needing to use the law to represent them. That is not happening. And I find that deeply, deeply problematic, because we have the tools, we have the frameworks, we actually have everything we need. We are just not able to use them. We need to figure out how to use the tools that we have. And just last for me, what we have, this Oppression Olympics, is actually an illusion. Patriarchy is patriarchy and oppresses us all. Uguti or trans and you are more oppressed, uguti which female or which woman, or feminism, if it's not intersectional, is not feminism. If you cannot see that under patriarchy, we are all oppressed and there's this thing that needs to be removed in order for us to chart a way forward that helps us to be freer than what we find ourselves now, then we are the problem, because then we end up fighting amongst ourselves about who deserves rights more than who. And that is where we are in terms of how, as Umama say, is that we are fighting amongst ourselves about who deserves rights. We all deserve human rights. We all human, and therefore we all deserve human rights. Not Uguti Omnye is more oppressed than the other, and therefore. And that's how I would like to leave it. I'm really, really thankful and honored to be having this conversation with you, my elders.
I want to express my deepest gratitude for your thoughts and reflections and for allowing us to walk with you through these memories and your vision for the future. Before we move to the Q&A, I want to welcome two important guests to our panel. The first person is Chancellor Dr. Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, who is the Chancellor at Nelson Mandela University. She serves as the chair of the UN Committee of Experts and Public Administration. She has a very long CV, including serving as the former Minister of Public Service and Public Administration. She's a former member of the Advisory Board of Women World Banking Africa, and she was one of the leading delegates of South Africa to Beijing in 1995. So I want to invite her to turn her camera on and join us. We're going to ask her to give a few words about her reflections of this discussion. And I also want to invite Ambassador Mavivi, who is the former deputy president of the ANT's Women's League and former high commissioner to Namibia. I also want to invite her to turn on her camera. If I could ask both of you in a few minutes, because we want to maybe move to the Q&A before Dr. Pumzile has to leave, to share your thoughts in a few minutes about this conversation in Beijing. So I'll start with Dr. Fraser Muleketi, and then we'll allow the Ambassador Mavivi to have the concluding words.
Thank you very much, moderator. And I just like to say to the panel that this was incredible. Wow, it was quite something getting these rich inputs. I'm going to just draw on a few quotes and then go to a specific experience whilst at Beijing. I think Bev is absolutely right. Patriarchy is patriarchy and it oppresses us all. I think that is one takeaway. A second one is the whole issue of reproductive rights. The whole issue of women's rights as human rights and human rights as women's rights. It's something that's come up throughout the discussion in different ways. So a thought that I would like to place on the table, and this is something that also came through in the hours of negotiation at Beijing. So, I mean, you ask, so what was the feeling when the platform of action was adopted? It was exhilarating, but I must also say that the negotiators were bone tired, exhausted. And I'm going to explain that in a particular context. What we shouldn't forget is the interconnectedness of the various conferences. Because with Beijing, where we had a challenge around language, in particular around reproductive rights and reproductive health, amongst others. And Ditsy talk, Bev spoke about the issue of language around sexuality. We actually drew on the language from the International Conference on Population Development that took place in the preceding year. That was 5 to 13 September 1994. The reason that was important was because there were governments and delegations who came to Beijing to try to reverse the language of Cairo. That was the Cairo conference. And I raise this because as we look at what we call a blueprint today, the Beijing platform of action, we should also not become complacent, because there are those out there who also want to reverse the language in Beijing, of Beijing. So much as we want to expand it and ensure that we integrate some of the changes, we should always be alert to that. And we've seen that in subsequent meetings. We've seen it at the Beijing +5, at Beijing +10, and so it goes on. So always being on our guard, because I think after Cairo and after Beijing, there was almost a view from many feminists across the African continent and elsewhere, a view of we've achieved a great moment. Maybe we could step back. But you know, with this agenda, there is never a moment you can step back and say you've reached a vista, you're going to overlook whatever is forward. And hence it is heartening that we hear that the younger generation, the intergenerational group coming through, are angry and angry for the right reasons. So I'd almost say go to section C1 of the Beijing platform of action the strategic objective that looks at the whole issue of increasing women's access throughout the life cycle to appropriate, affordable, and quality healthcare, information, and related services. Look at the language there, look at the references to the Cairo conference and that, and never forget, Cairo was a battle. Beijing was a battle. It was not easy, and the way Bev describes it, and I think Bridget and others will remember when it was 3 o'clock in the morning and we got the adoption of the platform of action. It was a bloody battle because the Africa group was not cohesive. The progressives in the Africa group came together. But I think generally there were divisions, and it's around the points that Ambassador Ntinso has raised, that we're not talking about a homogeneous force, that everyone was supporting it and would. So the refreshing radical impatience is what we would have to build on. I also like the point, and I'm going to conclude with this, I'll bring 2 points together there, that we need to replace systemic change with representation and link that to the whole issue. And I'm not going to repeat what was raised there, but link that to the issue that we've got to look at the institutions that are in place and how we build on those institutions, and we actually force them to act in the way in which they should. Because I think in too many instances, as pointed out, we go too easy on institutions. We go too easy on the use of the tools that exist. We don't enforce the use of CEDAW in national jurisdictions to the extent to which we should. We don't use it in regional jurisdictions to the extent to which we should. So whilst Phumzile is fighting a battle on the international front, we need to do our bit on every other front and not hold back, because the minute you let it go, a toolkit is just a toolkit if it's not used and used for implementation purposes. So thank you very much. You took us through the journey today, and I must say the beauty of it was the way in which we had a movement in South Africa that supported it. It's time to do that again, to the extent to which it was done then, with the talk in the taxis, in the shebeens, in around the dinner tables, in every setting and meeting, will remind everyone that this battle is not over yet and we've not given up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these remarks and this summation of some of your reflections. We will now move to Ambassador Mavivi. We will give her a few minutes. We will skip the Q&A simply because as I went through the questions, we've answered many of them, and we also want to be conscious of time. So Ambassador Mavivi, we will finish and round up at 15 after the hour. After Ambassador Mavivi, we will have concluding remarks from Professor Pamela Maseko. Ambassador. Ambassador, are you able to turn your mic on and your video on?
Sorry about that. I was saying that I came in late because I had a health issue to attend to. But from what I heard, it's a wow from our presenters. I'm happy UNISA was able to organize this, and I'm going to start with the issues which were somehow raised. For instance, the backlash which is taking place, for instance, in Turkey, where the government has withdrawn even from the convention. And by the way, Beijing, CEDAW, and its protocol was adopted by many countries with reservations. And those reservations remain. Having served at CEDAW, we appealed to those countries to remove the reservation. And it's very difficult on issues of culture, religion, pregnancy, and also on issues of sexual orientation. So the challenge still stands. I don't think we must be proud that we have so many countries which have adopted, but they've adopted with reservations. And it is shown that in their implementation, they don't implement such things and they're not about to implement them. So the issue which is raised by Geraldine of a women's movement, not only in our countries, but also international, is very important. In Africa, we've got power. International, we've got other organizations, the Women's International Democratic Federation, etc. They seem to have taken a back seat. In some cases, they are actually dying a natural death. The issues which were raised by Phumzile, our leader there in the UN, are so much important. We need a dialogue with the young people. We need a dialogue with men, both young and old. I participated when I came back from Namibia in some of the dialogues organized under Charlotte Maxeke, whom we are celebrating this year. And when we started speaking about what we went through and what we achieved, those young people, both young men and young women, were blown up and said, we don't know these things you're talking about. Where have you been? Why are you not talking about these things? Because we wouldn't be starting from scratch if we knew what you achieved. So it's very important that we follow on this generational equality, not only at international level, but also in our countries. We have not moved many women. For instance, the rural women who informed Usistenji, Ambassador Ntinso, that they want to get into the kitchen. As a women's coalition, we adopted actually a slogan saying, a woman's place is where she wants to belong. Because at that time, we're trying to build consensus on issues of the Constitution and to take as many women as possible to be able to participate in a new democratic society. We haven't moved those women. They're still outside the mainstream and still fighting to get into the kitchen. So those are the issues which I think if we are to go forward with Beijing, we must start addressing. The last Commission on the Status of Women I attended actually dissected the fact that it's now almost 20 years, and I think now it's now close to going to 25, where we adopted Beijing, and we know the challenges which the panelists discussed, and Geraldine, who was there, also spoke about. New issues have also arisen, like femicide, as it said, trafficking in women, climate change, the issues which you find in the Africa Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, the issue of quotas, which even in our country has not been adopted. That's why we don't have the 50-50 in parliament. We only have 46 representation of women in parliament. The 50-50 we achieved in cabinet because the ANC is the only party in South Africa which has been able to adopt this 50-50. Local government were 41%. Again, we must look at the new debate which is coming up about electoral systems. I don't know, and I haven't heard how women are tackling this issue, because we ended up with proportional representation, which is in the interim constitution. And this is the system which have been able to bring women into parliament and even in the ANC itself, because it's a list system. But now with the suggestion of a mixed system, and we know what a mixed system does. We have the experience of local government, where the directly elected ward councillors, very few of them are women. So those are some of the challenges we must address. The LGBTQ, I'm happy Devi has addressed it. The termination of pregnancy, we are not even agreed in our own country on this, let alone international.
Yes.
Patriarchy affects both men and women, and that's why we find women who have elected, who are in parliament, still speaking male voices. Thank you very much. It's a pity we don't have so much time, but the challenges are huge, and the backlash is also huge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mavivi, for this insight. And you're right, I think we could keep talking about this for days in and days out. So thank you so much for your insight. To conclude this evening, I would like to introduce Professor Pamela Maseko. She's been appointed as Executive Dean of the Humanities Faculty at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. She was previously the Executive Dean of the Humanities Faculty at Northwest University. Her scholarship in sociolinguistic and language policy and planning has focused on the effects of language policy and education in African multilingual contexts. Recently, her scholarship has extended to social historical linguistics, where she is using historical literary data producers over a 150-year period to investigate social cultural practices in the Eastern Cape Nguni pre-colonial society. She has published in these areas and has been consulted on language issues in South African higher education. She is currently co-editing a literature series published in the UK ZN Press, dedicated to republishing newspaper writings of little-known but highly authoritative Cape Nguni early literates of the early 19th and 20th centuries. Pamela Maseko has worked at Rote University and the University of Cape Town and the Western Cape in South Africa. She has also held fellowships at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, now known as SOAS, as well as the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study. Before I pass the mic over to Professor Maseko, I want to thank you for the privilege and opportunity that you have offered me to be part of this conversation. And thank you very much for the participants for the time that they have offered to share their insights, their memories, and their hopes for the future. Thank you, Professor Maseko.
Thank you, Professor Buka. Colleagues, friends of our university, students, staff, community members, and all the participants watching via different online platforms across the globe and in different time zones. Greetings from Nelson Mandela University, who are hosting this phenomenal event. Let me start off by acknowledging the Chancellor of our university, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Muleketi, the Chairperson of Council, Ambassador Nosipo January Badel, members of Council from the 3 hosting universities, Mama Teja, Brigalia Bam, former IEC Commissioner, and Walter Sicily University Chancellor, the incredible panelists of today's dialogue, Dr. Mlambo Ncuka, Ambassador Mtinto, Dr. Bev Titi, and our moderator, Prof. Boka. Ambassador Mayakayaga Manzini, and all the dignitaries I may not have mentioned by name. The management and leadership from different universities, deputy vice chancellors, deans of faculties, heads of entities, senior academics, student leadership, students, and members of the public. My task tonight is to express a word of gratitude to the organizers and partners of this phenomenal dialogue. But before that, it is perhaps important that I recognize the collective grief, loss of life, and loss of normalcy that the world is experiencing at this point in time as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. The introduction to the United Nations policy brief on the impact of COVID-19 on women states that the year 2020 was intended to be groundbreaking for gender equality. But instead, with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back. The pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerabilities in social, political, and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. Our call from this side of the globe is that we dare not stop in our pursuit of dignity for all, despite these global health challenges. Colleagues, I would like to echo the Vice Chancellor in her opening remarks when she stated that Nelson Mandela University has committed itself to the revitalization of the humanities and center the greater humanity and our planet in the knowledge production process. As a university and faculty, guided by, amongst others, the values of Ubuntu and humanizing pedagogy, it becomes important that we begin to interrogate the intellectual histories and knowledge production processes that have put women and queer communities in the margins in the academy. The Beijing moment, as well as other historical moments in women's contribution to social change, are very important as we interrogate the revitalization of the humanities in our university. Before I conclude and then go and do the things, I want to, I must say, I'm particularly excited by the commitment displayed here tonight by the speakers and also the charts that we've seen throughout. But I'm excited by the commitment displayed in centering or recentering women's voices, the voices that are continuously marginalized, but which are center of existence to many of our celebrated leaders. As our university namesake, Nelson Mandela, says of Nosekeni Mandela, his mother, about whom we know absolutely nothing, except for having birthed Mandela and walked about 20 kilometers to place the then 12-year-old Mandela under Chief Jongindaba as his guide and influence. These women, whose names are hidden deep in the archives of history, are critical in our understanding of our past and in making sense of the present and in forging an inclusive future. It is atrocious that they are invisibilized, even with their visionary leadership and daring deeds. In the process of the revitalization of the humanities, let us bring them to life through books, in our lecture halls, basically in all forms of knowledge production and dissemination in the academy. The conversations today have been phenomenal, but it cannot end here, Dr. Makokwana. Let us do something and recognize this in our intellectual project. And let us honor the great women who educated us today on issues of women and gender. Let me now give thanks. I want to start with the Center for Women and Gender Studies, its partners at Rhodes University and the University of Pretoria for bringing us all together. Dr. Babalwa Makokwana, Dr. Spokazi Magadla, Dr. Atambile Masola, we see you at Mandela University and we value your collaboration on the academic project of this region. I wish to also acknowledge Professor Phumla Gola, who occupies the research chair on African feminist imaginations, hosted by the Center for Women and Gender Studies in our faculty. Without the following participants who have helped us brought us together tonight, we would not have been here. I want to start with the Nelson Mandela University Management, represented here today by Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Muleketi, our Chancellor, and as we've heard, who led the delegation, South African delegation to the Beijing conference. Ambassador Nozipho January Badel, the Chair of Council of our university, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, our Vice Chancellor, who has supported and spearheaded the project that centers humanities in the academy. Prof. Mutwa's office facilitated the invitation to the UN Women's Executive Director. Thank you, Professor Mutwa, for that. Professor Andre Kitt, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation. Professor Kitt has been the engine in establishing and supporting the programs of the Center for Women and Gender Studies. Thank you, Andre. Mr. Lebohang Hashatse, Deputy Vice Chancellor for People and Operations, and his team in communication and marketing have supported the marketing of this dialogue. Professor Cheryl Foxcroft, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Learning and Teaching, Dr. Thandi Mgwebi, the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Research and Internationalization, and Dr. Laura Best and Ms. Babalwa Shushu in the Vice Chancellor's office have really helped in facilitating communication between the Vice Chancellor's office and our international guests. Our ICT team, Dr. Thomas Helmer and Poncho Mabena, along with the student organizers under Ms. Wendy Adams at the Center for Women and Gender Studies, thank you very much for your efforts in putting us together. We would also like to thank the UN Women's Executive Directors team for availing themselves for different briefings leading to this day. Most importantly, colleagues, without our speakers tonight, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, Ambassador Mamtenjiwe Mtinto, Dr. Bev Ditsi, and our moderator, Professor Yolanda Booker, we would not have had such a feast. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We wish to also acknowledge delegation from our partner university, Rhodes University, delegation led by the DVC Academic and Student Affairs, Dr. Mabukang Munapula Mapasela, the registrar, Dr. Adele Moodley, the Dean of Humanities, Professor Innocent Msindo, and the Head of Politics and International Studies, Professor Sally Matthews. Lastly, and importantly, I would also like to convey a special thanks to our partner, the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, represented here today by their CEO, Professor Sarah Muswetsa. The NIHSS general support for the Women's Archival Project at Nelson Mandela University is acknowledged with appreciation. I want to end off here by just having us think about the language isiXhosa and how it captures gratitude. The isiXhosa conceptualization of gratitude is very apt for moments such as these, and for the project of the revitalization of the humanities at our university. In isiXhosa, we say, nisenze abantu, meaning we have reinvigorated us as a people. We also give gratitude with a wish for sustained relationships. And we say Nangamso, which literally means, may your kindness continue tomorrow and beyond. Lastly, in gratitude, we invoke, pardon me, I just lost my screen. Sorry for that. In gratitude, we also invoke expansion and growth. And we say Makwande. Thank you very much, colleagues. And I think we've come to the end of the program now. Thank you very much.
Malibongwe.
Igama
Malibongwe.
Igama lamakhosikazi.
Malibongwe.
Igama lamakhosikazi. Malibongwe nalonyana.
Malibongwe. All right, colleagues, I think I'm on again. I believe we have come to the end of our session today. I believe I speak for everyone who has been inside that indeed it has been a fiery discussion. And we'd like to thank every single person that has made today a success. We thank you so much. Just in the ending of it all, we'll be ending it off with the trailer to one of the latest films that Dr. Bev Ditsi has released, particularly on celebrating the 25 years of the Beijing conference. So ngalo mazi sithi siyabulela kakhulu Center for Women and Gender Studies and all of its partners here today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Lesbiana, yo soy. I am.
Hoy soy
lesbiana. Yo soy lesbiana. Porque me gusta y me da la gana.
25 years ago, you and I met at the lesbian tent.
25 years on, here we are.
25 years ago, lesbians from all over the world arrived at the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, and took a stand. This year, we decided to come together, not just to go down memory lane.
Tag, it's so good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
But to also share and celebrate what was the most successful lesbian visibility campaign in history.
Make this a conference for all women, regardless of their sexual orientation.
We were confronting what was actually a huge uphill battle.
Lesbian issues were not seen as women's issues.
Most people were saying the usual kind of, you're disrupting the agenda.
They wanted us to tone it down.
There were rumors that we were all going to run topless through the street. They confiscated some literature at one point.
We were constantly under observation.
At that time, even realized how much they were afraid of us. All 40,000 women from all around the world had to be moved because of lesbians.
It was a major lesson to the world that we are everywhere.